So could you give me a kind of a more, I guess, the historical context of where the language of work came from? Is that the kind of question?
Sure.
Is that...
Yeah, I have to really go back in history a bit here because I've been in the business, for like 50 years, and a lot of things transpired in there. It's kind of interesting to me. Because I started out as a chemistry teacher, I obviously have a propensity towards looking at things from a systems point of view. I mean, if one looks at the periodic table, as one looks at that, that's so organized in a sense, and it makes so much sense once you understand the basics of it, that you can predict things from it.
Mm.
And that really moved science forward. And I suppose that sort of background to begin with had a very strong influence on me when it came down to ultimately developing this language of work. In my early career, I wrote some instructional programs. I happened to take a job after the Peace Corps teaching in a Job Corps center. And at that Job Corps center, I needed to develop materials because we didn't have much of anything that was relevant to our particular population of students. And so I started writing everything on dining room behavior to how to get a job, things of that sort. And apparently they found them fairly useful, so they started circulating stuff that I had developed to other Job Corps centers. And in that process, somebody said to me, when they looked at one of my instruction programs, and they said, "Did you ever think about putting some behavioral objectives in here?" And I said, "Well, what's that?"
Okay.
And they introduced me to the notion of behavioral objectives, all of Dr. Robert Mager, who had been writing these books at that time. And I got a couple of these books and I read it. And it was fascinating to me because he was trying to capture behavior, in a sense, as a goal, an objective, something that was measurable, and it had conditions to it, and it had some clear expectations to it. And I thought that was quite interesting, so I wrote some objectives to this instructional program, and they seemed to help a great deal in communicating the intent of this instructional effort. Shortly after that, I left the Job Corps and got hired by a company that was developing training for business and government. And there was an interesting individual there by the name of Dr. William A. Detterline. And Dr. Detterline, who had been a student of behavior at, I forget which college he went to. It might have even been at Harvard, but I just don't remember. Anyway, he was applying a lot of principles to the design of instruction materials as well. So I go there to work at this company, and the next thing I know, I'm thinking I'm going to be one of their writers of programmed instruction in those days. And it turns out I became sort of the head of this company in a role that saw me traveling with him often and teaching with him the things that he was introducing. And among the things beyond objectives, and by the way, in that process, I worked with Robert Mager as well, because he was a consultant to this company, and several other people who were leaders in the field of what was evolving to be human performance technology. And I remember one time we went out to Transworld Airlines, and he had me teach a workshop for 4 days, or, 2 weeks. And in that process, there were 3 days in which I had to teach things about stimulus response consequences, which is detailed, algorithmic types of ways of looking at behavior, which added on a level of my understanding of what behavior is. I had learned objectives. I'd gotten ideas about conditions and outcomes. And here I was getting things about this, how to the stimulus respond to things, lots of things on the consequence side and feedback and so on. I even wrote some programmed instruction in those days, and all of that. Then I joined the international, or what was then the National Society for Programmed Instruction, and started to do some presentations and rub shoulders with some other people, Gary Rumler, Roger Kaufman, Don Toasty, and some others. And I would learn other things from them of how they were perceiving the behavior. And then when this opportunity came along, several years went by. I had become the director of corporate training at a major corporation. And then I went to a company that wanted me to do some total quality management, which was evolving at that point in time. And that's when...
So is that around the 80s or?
Yeah, that would have been, piece all this together again. I left there in 79, 89. It would have been just the end of the 80s, 1990, when I went to International Technology down in California.
Okay.
And there was this delightful vice president of an engineering division who had asked me over to help improve the processes that his team was attempting to use to do environmental engineering studies. And he said they just need to understand their work better individually and as it relates to others. Can you help us? And so as I looked at that effort and what he was trying to do, I realized it was work, and it's just work. And work to me, as I began to look at that word, was like behavior, but it seemed to be somehow slightly different, because we kept defining stuff over here in behavior performance, and I'm thinking, I know what they're trying to say over there, but everybody understands, and everybody does work. I thought, well, you know, I've got to do something so that these people understand what their work is, because what really fascinated me more and more was that how I would go into meetings, whether they were with my own staff or with engineers, technicians, or whatever they were in these companies, and I'd hear them talk about the issues they had with work. And what I would find out was that they sort of all seemed to think they were talking about the same thing at the same time, but the reality was they were talking about different aspects of something and didn't realize it, and were not coming to some clarity around what that work was. And this was very true in this particular engineering division, even though they were making money. I mean, they could go out and actually do cleanup sites and so on. They just could have done it better, okay? And had more fun in the process and related to one another better. So given that I was supposed to improve the work, I needed to have a pretty clear idea what work was. So I took that accumulated knowledge up to that point in time, stretching back again to writing objectives, doing stimulus, response, consequences, programmed instruction, whatever it was that I was asked to define and to come up with. And I said to myself, that has something to do, a value that can be used to define work. Working towards kind of what ultimately became a work formula, you know, again based upon sort of that science background. If you're going to really predict and clarify and move forward on something, you have to have a very clear, concise way to do it that everybody can understand and use. And so that's how I was borrowing, in a sense, if you want to, the idea of stimulus out of objectives. Given this, for example, you're going to do this over here, which is an output for this reason, for these standards, that stimulus are needed, processes are needed, these various elements, and I started to put labels on them, which ultimately became the 6 elements, the language of work, or the work formula specifically. And that's how that eventually became what it is today. And then by going out and doing this in all kinds of companies, I was able to find all the applications fact, when I wrote the first book, I remember almost getting chills at times, realizing that as I was applying this formula to these various applications, it was a universal answer to how to go about doing it. And so we have evolved to a point where virtually any kind of work can be defined, understood, improved, made better, communicated among one another much more clearly than it ever has been possible before.
All right. Yeah. So going all the way back from the periodic table to today,
It is.
you created something really, really incredible.